In this and the next video, I will be talking about economic, social and cultural rights in general in this first clip, and then in the second one, more specifically about the right to housing as one particular example of such a right. I'll be addressing the first of the reading questions as I advance through this first video, and then the second and third reading questions will be addressed in the second clip. I think you will have noticed by now that the content of these clips that I'm doing now stands at least somewhat in tension with the structure in which I basically post them. So if the category of civil and political rights is already quite broad, and if we can already within them distinguish between, for example, core rights and more peripheral parts of a right, and if positive and negative obligations are also in fact a part of all of these rights, well, then the problem becomes even more obvious when it comes to the very broad category of economic, social and cultural rights. Let's indeed have a look at the 1966 International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, which includes in Article 6 the right to work, in Article 7 the right to just and fair working conditions, in Article 8 the right to form and join labor unions, Article 9 social security, Article 10 family, maternal and children's rights, Article 11 the right to an adequate standard of living, and as we will see in the next video, that actually includes a number of rights under it. In Article 12, the right to health, in Articles 13 and 14, the right to education, and finally in Article 15, the right to participation in cultural life. This quite obviously raises a number of questions. This is a host of issues, which obviously they are interrelated, but they are also quite distinct and pose quite distinct also political challenges. And in fact, if you look, for example, at Article 8, the right to form and join a labor union, we might even argue that, well, is this really just an economic right, or is this actually also a civil right and possibly a political right as well? The domain of human rights with all these various rights is not easily categorized, and we can question these categories, including the most fundamental ones, such as economic, social and cultural rights. That being said, the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights is, of course, the destination point of a longer journey that, and the chapter briefly mentions that, included Franklin Delano Roosevelt's famous 1941 speech on the four freedoms, and more particularly in this context relevant, the freedom from want, and obviously also Article 25 on the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, which established the right to an adequate living, which we then later see put down in Article 11 of the ICESCR. And when we look at the status of ratifications, we also see that the ICESCR is, with 170 state parties, quite comparable to the ICCPR with 173, so only 3 more state parties that have agreed to the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. However, when it comes to the optional protocol, which establishes an individual complaint mechanism, when it comes to the ICCPR and the Human Rights Committee, in fact, there are 116 state parties that allow for individuals to submit complaints on these rights to the Human Rights Committee, whereas when it comes to the ICESCR, there are only 26 state parties and 23 more signatories that allow for individual communications to go to the committee. And we can see here also that many of the European and Western European states are actually not doing all that well when it comes to accepting this possibility. Once again, we will be addressing the role, the importance of these treaty bodies and individual complaint mechanisms in a few weeks' time when we talk about the UN human rights system. Let's look at some of the guiding principles, overarching principles of the Covenant. In Article 1, and by now you will not be surprised to see this, we have a reaffirmation of the right to self-determination, which is a right of peoples, a collective rights, but very important, as you may be guessing, in the context of economic, social and cultural rights, because it includes, for example, the collective right to dispose of the natural wealth and resources, which is really quite important for peoples. We have the principle of equality and non-discrimination, which the textbooks describes as an overarching principle, and it obviously is also when it comes to other rights. However, in regard to economic, social and cultural rights, this guarantee is important because it is somewhat of a counterpoint to the progressive realization part, to which I will come in a moment. Even though, because of the notion of progressive realization, it is to some extent more difficult to bring a case against the state. There's no difference when it comes to there being equal access and equal providence of these rights. And this already brings us to the aspect of progressive realization of rights, and therefore also to the first reading question that I pose to you. Given that these questions, these rights, or many of these rights at least, such as the right to housing, to which I'll get to in a moment, but also the right to education, the right to health, and to some extent even the right to food, are all subject to resources. So you have to have resources and the capacities to provide for them as a state. The human rights system does recognize that a state might be unable to effectively provide the full range and full enjoyment of these rights immediately. And in order to understand further what this exactly means or entails, it is worthwhile to look briefly at Article 2.1 of the International Covenant, which is on the applicability of these rights. And there it is stated that each state party has to undertake steps individually and through international assistance and cooperation, especially economic and technical, to the maximum of its available resources, with a view of achieving progressively the full realization of the rights recognized in the present covenant by all appropriate means, including possibly legislative means. This entails three more concrete points in my view. First, you have to provide these rights to the maximum of your available resources. So there is some obligation on the state here to provide that it is doing everything that it can in order to achieve this progressive realization of rights. Indeed, as the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights pointed out already in 1990 in its general comment number 3 on the nature of state obligations, this implies deliberate, targeted and concrete action on behalf of state parties. And this is the standard to which they will be held, for example, in state reports. Second, if you talk about progressively realizing, that does imply to some extent that you will at least not retrogress. So if you have achieved a certain standard with regard to the various social and economic rights that we're talking about here, as a state party, you cannot really then anymore take them away, or at least you will not be able to do so without a proper justification. And as with other human rights, the question of limitations is one that is very salient here. And finally, there are minimum core obligations. And we already talked about this extensively when it comes to civil and political rights. And again, in General Comment 3, the Committee of Economic, Social and Cultural Rights points that out quite explicitly. And you will also see in the second video now on the right to housing what this concretely entails. I leave it at this, though I do want to draw your attention to the notes of this video, which you can find on YouTube, where I also provide a link to a short knowledge clip on the topic of progressive realization, where University of Nottingham professor Aoife Nolan explains the various aspects of this notion in further detail.